This Explain Everything video will show you how to use a simple stats tool for lab analysis that is commonly taught in math classes, but less well known among science teachers. The box and whisker plot can be used to visualize the distribution of data from repetitive trials and generate some basic statistics students can use to formulate an argument for their lab conclusion. The data examples used in this presentation are based on the Mass and Change lab in Unit 1 of the Modeling Chemistry materials. This tool can also be used in the analysis of other modeling chemistry labs, such as the Empirical Formula lab in Unit 5, the Nail lab in Unit 7, and the Silver Copper lab in Unit 8. Here are two data tables we will use as examples for making box and whisker plots. A box and whisker plot presents the data from lowest to highest values in 4 sections called quartiles. Each quartile represents 25% of the data points. So the first step in preparing a box and whisker plot is to order the data from lowest to highest values as shown here. This may be done by hand for smaller data sets or by using a spreadsheet when sorting larger data sets. There are 5 key points needed to make the box and whisker plot. These points mark the upper and lower boundaries of each quartile. They are the minimum, Q1, Q2, or the median, Q3, and the maximum. The minimum and maximum values are readily found at the 2 ends of the ordered data sequence. The median is the middle value, the midpoint of the sequence, as you can see marked on the tables. For an odd number of data points, the median is the data point in the middle of the sequence. For an even number of data points, the median is the average of the 2 middle data points. In our examples, there are 13 measurements, so the 7th value is the median. Next, each half of the data is divided in half again to form 4 quartiles. The midpoint in each half is called Q1 and Q3, as you see marked on the 2 data tables. Some resources on making box and whisker plots say to exclude the median point when finding Q1 and Q3, while others seem to include it. We included the median when finding Q1 and Q3 in these data sets. If we had excluded the median, we would have had 6 data points, which would require finding the average of the 3rd and 4th points in each half. Using this method, Q1 would have a value of negative 25 thousandths of a gram for the expanding steel wool and 15 thousandths of a gram for the heated steel wool. Building the box and whisker plot begins by creating a data axis with a linear scale, a step that students may be prone to skip. This is important in order for students to see how data is distributed across the data range. The box for the plot is bounded by Q1 and Q3. A set of 3 vertical lines are drawn on the data axis to mark the Q1, median, and Q3 values. These lines are then connected to form a box. The median is seen as a line inside the box. The range inside the box is called the interquartile range, or IQR, and represents the range and distribution of the middle 50% of the data. The minimum and maximum values are each marked with a dot over its point on the data axis. The dots are then connected to the box with a whisker line. Each whisker represents the outer 25% of the data on either side of the box. In other words, these show the 50% of the data lying outside the interquartile range. The box and whisker plot gives students a visual representation of where the data points are most concentrated and where they are most spread out. The smaller a particular quartile is, the tighter the data in that range. Ideally, we'd expect the interquartile range to have the greatest agreement between the values, with the outer 2 quartiles showing more spread. Think bell curve here. The box and whisker plot also visually flags the possible presence of outliers in the data when the whiskers are particularly long. Now let's look at how the students can use the box and whisker plot to identify possible outliers. We would expect the values in the interquartile range, or the box, to contain our most representative data for the experiment. The further from the box data points fall, the more likely we are to find values influenced by random experimental error and student mistakes. But how can students decide which values would be considered outliers and possibly excluded from their interpretation? Some are obviously out of line with the rest of the data. Others are harder to call. The guidelines used with the box and whisker plot are based on the size of the interquartile range. Any data falling outside the box or IQR by more than 1.5 times the size of the box, or 1.5 times the IQR, can be considered suspect and treated as an outlier. Notice the calculations presented in the tables and the resulting acceptable ranges. In the expanding steel wool experiment, the range from Q1 to Q3 is 0.02 of a gram. So any data in our example that exceeds the boundaries of the box by 1.5 times this, or by 0.03 of a gram, would be considered an outlier. In this experiment, any value lower than negative 0.05 grams or higher than 0.03 grams can be treated as an outlier. The lowest data point, negative 0.12 of a gram, can now be identified as an outlier. For the steel wool, the acceptable range extends from negative 25 thousandths to positive 95 thousandths of a gram. This would justify calling the 1100ths of a gram an outlier. The value of negative 0.03 is barely over the calculated limit, which makes its inclusion or exclusion a little less clear. Students will have to discuss how this point fits within the meaning of the rest of the data. Here are the box and whisker plots with obvious outliers removed. Notice the box was not changed, just the whisker lengths. If several values were identified as outliers that were associated with significant experimental errors students observed, such as omitting or adding a beaker in the second mass reading, these values may significantly skew the median. In that case, students may decide to take out the data affected by large experimental mistakes and recalculate the stats for the box and whiskers. Otherwise, students should simply omit one or two less egregious outliers from the whiskers of the plot without changing the size of the box. In the adjusted box and whisker plot for the expanding steel wool, students should notice the upper 50% of the data, in other words, the upper two quartiles, fall within 0.01 grams of zero. With a balance uncertainty of plus or minus 0.01 grams, the values of this range would indicate the steel wool had a constant mass during these trials. Students should also notice the lower 50% of the data falls between negative 1/100th of a gram and negative 0.04 of a gram, which is outside the uncertainty of the balance. Since they are all negative changes, students may conclude a small mass loss occurred in these trials. Students should be able to relate this to observations by some groups that small bits of steel wool fell off that they did not include in their final mass. In the plot of steel wool heated, students should be able to see that 3/4 of the data have values from positive 0.02 of a gram to positive 0.06 of a gram. Since these are larger than the uncertainty in the balance readings, the steel wool does show a gain of some mass. The one value showing a mass loss, which does not fit the meaning of the rest of the data, was also at the edge of the acceptable range that we had calculated. In summary, using the box and whisker plot can be an effective tool for promoting sound analysis of lab data for high school chemistry students. This representation breaks data into understandable chunks that are readily plotted by hand or by using an online app. The plot visually displays where data values agree most strongly and where more spread is evident in the data, as well as providing a simple statistical method for identifying outliers. Because of this, students can move beyond making claims because the data says so, to citing a few understandable stats as concrete evidence while they construct their argument for the meaning of the data. In addition, the use of a spreadsheet for collecting all class data readily allows students to accurately order data sets and find the 5 points for the box and whisker plots manually, or by using the quartile function in the spreadsheet.